for now.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's attending today's webinar. It's nice to reconvene as a group here in the new year for our first Baskerville webinar of 2022. And we're very fortunate today to have Professor Hooman Estelami, a professor at the Gabelli School of Business at Fordham University in New York City. He is the author of several books, including Marketing Strategy, Marketing Turnarounds, Simplified Business Research Methods, and Marketing Financial Services. He is also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Bank Marketing, and he has previously served as the co-editor of the Journal of Product and Brand Management. His research is wide and varied, and it has appeared in over 50 journals. Some of those articles have won awards. Today, he'll be talking to us about his, I suspect, most recent publication, The Americans of Urumia, Iran's First Americans and Their Mission to the Assyrian Christians, which was just published in the previous year, 2021, by Bahar Books. I know we all very much look forward to hearing about the book and listening to your lecture, and I turn it over to you, Professor Estelami.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shannon. I want to thank, obviously, Dr. Shannon and Dr. Bakhtiari for the invitation, and also, of course, the Baskerville Institute for having invited me to this talk. And I think the collection of presentations and the collection of work that has been accumulating through the Baskerville Institute has been quite inspirational. So I'm completely honored to be presenting my work. And of course, very thankful for everyone that is attending so that, I'm able to share what I have been working on. What I'm going to do is I'm actually also going to share the screen so that we can actually see the presentation I have for you is very visual in nature. I want to give the sensation of what the earliest Americans that resided in Iran experienced. Fortunately, they themselves documented with very good, record keeping as to what it is that they did and the world that they lived in. And so as a result of that, there is a lot of visuals, a lot of pictures that are available that allow us to take a look at their world at the same time that we talk about their world. And so I'm going to attempt to share my screen so that we can all sort of see, what we have. I assume this is working. Is that right? Okay, great. Thank you. So, what we have, this is just sort of a visual of the front page or the cover, if you will, of the book itself. I have to always kind of clarify, what it is that I have been doing, why am I doing this, especially because my own field is not history or theology or anything that one would think is remotely related to the earliest missionaries or missionary work altogether. My own line of work for almost 3 decades has been to study decision behavior. So how do people make decisions specifically in business context? Because of course I teach at a business, in a business school. And so, I look at things like decision behavior related to pricing. So what happens, for example, when you raise prices? What happens when you have to make financial decisions? Unfortunately, today is one of those days where we're experiencing these as consumers, rising prices, a volatile stock market. So for a long time, most of my focus has actually been in understanding that. And so the work that I'm presenting to you is really on top of that. So I haven't really quit my day job. I'm still doing research in these areas. And the research has transitioned over about 10 years. About 10 years ago, it transitioned into looking not only at as consumers as to how they make their decisions, but also on the issue of how managers kind of make their decisions that would perhaps change the environment in which consumers exist. And so a lot of inquiry into issues of ethics, issues of emotional decision-making, issues where you begin to put managers in very unique situations and ask yourself what happens. And that is a connection point in my own research where, this line of study that eventually, believe it or not, ended up in studying American missionaries came into play. And it actually all has to do with Morgan Schuster. He too was, of course, in the banking world. As I started to look at expanding the scope of the studies that I was doing on decision making, I asked myself, well, what did Morgan Schuster observe? What were his experiences? And we've had two wonderful presentations on Morgan Schuster through the Baskerville Institute. But if you've read Schuster's book, it's a fascinating sort of dissection of how individuals made decisions. He tried to understand people's motivations, how it is that that they do things or don't do things, how they react, how they overreact. And so that was informative. But of course, as I read Schuster further, I came across Baskerville. So I have to confess, my own initial sort of detailed interaction with just knowledge of Baskerville came through Schuster. Although I had some remote sort of understanding of who Baskerville was, it never really registered for me until I read Schuster's book. And it's what really grabbed my attention was two things. Number one, of course, that we had this amazing person that lost his life. And so that's a loss to humanity, if you will. But also the fact that he was teaching at a school run by Americans. And the natural inquiry that came about is, why were they even there in the first place? And so that's sort of the channeling of how my research fed into this line of work. As I started looking into this, of course, there are, as I looked at the list of attendees, there are many highly respectable historians among the attendees that know very well that there were generations of Americans that were living in Iran, growing up, having their own children, generation after generation, and so that was fascinating to me. I think the literature covers that in very scattered pieces. So if you have to read many different sources, many of them, in fact, are not published, so you have to go into the archives, which is what I spent considerable amount of time doing, trying to understand, what is it that, who were they? So for example, in this visual that you're looking at, these are actual extracts from recently released photo albums from missionary families. And what you're looking at is almost half of the individuals that you're looking at are actually, technically speaking, they're Iranians. They are Americans born in Iran. And so that is fascinating because it seems to be that there was an entire colony of multi-generational colony, if you will, of Americans that were living in Iran a long time ago. And so when we look at the timing of this, in fact, again, I just want to put things in perspective with respect to previous conversations and previous talks. We've had two wonderful talks on Morgan Schuster. We've had a wonderful talk on Howard Baskerville, and also Professor Zirinsky put the bigger picture of American missionaries for us to sort of understand and appreciate. My work takes us to some extent farther back, and it takes us away from Tabriz, where Baskerville was, takes us away from Tehran, where Morgan Schuster was, and so logistically, it brings us. This is an old missionary map. It is a very, I guess, misaligned. It's just the way it was drafted. It is misaligned. And what I want to do is I want to show you sort of the visuals of where the mission stations were. So I don't know, Matthew, if you're able to see the mouse. I just want to make sure that the attendees are able to see the mouse. Is that the mouse movement? So this is, thank you for that. So this is where the Urumia mission station range was. It's not a perfect map because some of the boundaries are probably a little exaggerated, especially to the east. But the critical thing about this is that there are a couple of things. One of them is that it's very remote. If you look at the location of where this mission field was, it is far from the major water sources of water, major towns. And it also, if you notice, it crosses the Ottoman border. And so originally, this group was, in fact, crossing the border. It wasn't really working just on Persia. And when I say originally, the starting point would have been 1834. So that's the starting point for the mission. One of the things that's unique about this group is really related to the geography of where they were located. And so when we look at the geography, and I want to show you again some other missionary maps and the visuals of the world that they had to live in, because it's very different from the world that we know of, that the other American missionaries that followed them decades later had to deal with. So this is, again, another old missionary map. This one is from the 1860s. And again, it shows you sort of the location of where Urumia is. So this is the body of water that we were looking at here is here. So this is Lake Urumia. This is Urumia itself. Just to give you a feel for how remote it is, you can't even see Tabriz on this map. It is to the right. And back then, it would have taken you 3 days just to make it through, just to get to Tabriz. And then other parts of, sort of the more metropolitan parts of the world, the closest would have been Mosul, which would have taken you weeks to get through. So a very isolated environment that they were actually active in. The town itself, again, depending on whether you've traveled to Iran and whether you are from the region, or whether you've actually even toured that region, the town of Urumia right now has a population of about 1 million. At the time that the first Americans to ever arrive in Persia came, it had a population of only 25,000. A couple of notable things about that population: about 10% were Jewish. The population of what is referred to as Assyrian or Nestorian Christians, which is the group that they were to focus on, was much smaller in the city, but they were much more present across what is called the Urumia Plain. And so the mass of the population was in the surrounding areas, and even a much larger mass farther away in the Ottoman region, so 110,000 roughly by Justin Perkins' estimate. In terms of the name itself, it's one of those frustrating things when you write about Urumia, is that there are probably more than a dozen spellings. And so the spelling that you see here being used at the top of this slide is the one that was most recently used by the missionaries at Urumia in their latest writings, around the World War I. The name itself means water town. The linguistic roots of the term mean water town, which kind of makes sense because, as you'll see, it is surrounded by many different sources of water, which actually influenced American lives in unfortunately, ways that we wouldn't want it to. So this is, again, most of the pictures that you're looking at have been taken by the missionaries themselves. So you're seeing the world as the missionaries saw the world. This is a view looking east from Urumia, and you can see in the far distance, you can see, Lake Urumia itself. This is Lake Urumia itself, and there are a couple of characteristics about it. It is full of salt, so there's animals, no fish or anything can grow in it. And transport in the early parts of missionary presence. So, for example, in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, the second half of the even the 19th century, was very difficult because there was no motorized movement of water vessels, and you had to rely on wind power to move around. So the lake itself really didn't have much function, and it was more of a barrier than anything as far as mobility was concerned. When you move west, what you see is agricultural fields, and you see, water tables and sort of agricultural areas where there is a wide presence of, agricultural activity, which to some extent had side effects because these sort of water pools that are put together become a source of disease. Diseases like malaria, cholera, and things of that nature were the primary cause for the death of many of the citizens there, and including the missionaries. So that was really the primary source of disease and health issues that everybody was experiencing. So on the positive side, it was a highly agriculturally productive area. And so a lot of the missionary work in the later years actually related to dealing with the population in those regions. As you go farther west, you're getting closer to the mountains. And so the angles of inclines significantly increase. And so this, for example, is an Assyrian village. And as you can sort of see, there are houses there, there are buildings there. It is a challenge to get there. The fact that it's a challenge to get there itself is by design to some extent for having set up these places of residency, because it's a defensive mechanism, allows isolation and allows protection against intruders and other kinds of violence that could be inflicted because of tribal differences and so on and so forth. And again, as you go farther west, the angles and the elevations become even more pronounced. And so this is, again, as I mentioned, critical because this was an isolated group that they had come to serve at that point in time. And again, you get a feel for the visuals of the geography that they had to deal with, the topography that they had to deal with, and as to how challenging it was. I mean, if you ask yourself, would I myself want to go on a hike in a space like this? You might question that, but these missionaries did. They actually took on these relatively challenging physical tasks to go from village to village and to kind of explore and serve the populations that they had been deployed to serve. Again, just to focus on some of the amazing things, this is sort of, again, in the Kurdish mountains. So the way to get around, the way it was done, little road systems were carved on the side of the mountain, and then you had to go through those. But again, talk about risk taking, talk about tolerance for risk. This is in fact one of the ways that they moved around. And so what you can see here is a transport vehicle, if you will, of some type that was used by the missionaries. In this case, what you see at the center is a female missionary and her child. And so they would get on these kinds of environments and move around. And at some point, in fact, some of the missionary images themselves are absolutely baffling as to what kinds of places they actually went with, this kind of sort of transportation modality. And so here you are at the edge of a cliff, probably about 1,000 feet, from the bottom of that cliff. And that is the kind of risk they actually took. Now, one of the interesting things about the missionaries in Urumia is that no life was lost because of falls. One would think that that would be the primary cause. Of the Urumia missionaries, the majority that were lost because of illness, and those illnesses were typically because of waterborne diseases, and only one missionary lost his life because of violence. And so the sources of data, as far as what I have used, are things that you see here. So a whole array of materials. So missionary memoirs, missionary records, mission documents that have been kept in the archives. One of the archives that I utilized a lot is the Presbyterian Historical Society. So for those of us in attendance that have been there in the archives, you're probably quite familiar with the archive reading room that's shown there. So a whole array of archival material, as well as cross-referencing with other sources. And that's where it becomes interesting. When you look at the archival material and you look at the what is known, and in some cases State Department records and archives within that environment that have been since made available, that things become more clear as to what was going on. In terms of the population that this particular group of American missionaries had come to serve, they are the followers of Nestorius, who in the 5th century kind of began to have some philosophical debates with the Roman Church on some fundamental issues like the nature of Christ. I'm not going to really get into that, partially because I'm not really qualified on that. That is really a theological issue. But it created a divide, and Nestorius was condemned by the Roman Church, and his followers were persecuted. They moved eastward to Persia, and they basically took refuge in the Kurdish mountains. There were also cases during the Sasanian period that they were persecuted. So there was this, going back to the elevation that I was talking about, this notion of the angle of incline. There was a reason for them to move into the Kurdish mountains because it was safer there. It was a much more defensive kind of an environment where they could protect themselves. There's a challenge in terminology, because as you read the missionary writings in the earlier days, they refer to the population as Nestorian. In fact, it was called a mission to the Nestorians originally. The term Assyrian shows up in later writings, and the Assyrian population covers more than just Nestorians, but in this group's writings and some of the British writings, it is primarily, especially in the Urumia area, the Nestorians. What makes it even more confusing is the use of the term Syrian. Has nothing to do with Syria. It is I guess the English version of the word Suryai, which means Syriac-speaking Christian. And that's how the Assyrians in the Urumia area refer to each other. So you see the term Syrian being used, especially toward the end of the 19th century and the early 1900s. In Farsi, we refer to Nestorians as Nasturi, and we refer to Assyrians as Ashuri. So those are the words that we are comfortable with and use in the Farsi context. That population was not really recognized by the West or even noticed by the West until the first part of the 19th century. And it really was because of an intelligence officer, a British intelligence officer that was operating in that environment, who had incredible linguistic skills. And so he discovered the group, but that discovery really didn't resonate with the American missionaries and just generally with the American population for another 2 decades. And it's only then that America took an interest in coming there to work with the Assyrian population. The preferred, by the way of referring to the population is Assyrian. Unfortunately, because of the persecutions that the group experienced, the Nestorian has some derogatory connotations to it. So we use that term quite a bit throughout this presentation, unless the missionaries were using the older designation at some point. Now, just to give a visual of the people they had come to serve, what you see on the right-hand side, again, these are coming directly from missionary photographs, is on the right-hand side, it's a family inside Urumia, so it's a very urban family, much refined, very much like any other family. And on the left-hand side, you see what in the missionary writings they refer to as mountain Assyrians or mountain Nestorians. So a rougher life, but a beautiful simplicity to the way they lived, a very pure sense of identity that they had. And so, but a rough, difficult life because of the mountains and the environment that they were in. So the Urumia missionaries primarily focused on what you see on the right-hand side. They extended their work into the Turkish range and into southern Mesopotamia in later years. But as the century evolved and moved forward, they moved much farther back to the original area being in Urumia. The work that I do focuses on 4 missionaries. The first being Justin Perkins. Perkins is known as sort of the first American to have come and resided in Iran. He was from Massachusetts, a graduate of Andover. One of the notable things about him was just, you can sort of see that sense of sacrifice in the process. He lost 6 of his 7 children, but he did many amazing things. One of the challenges that the Americans had when they had come to the Urumia area was that there was no written form of the what is called modern Syriac. So the classic or old Syriac language had changed, had evolved over the centuries, and what was being spoken in Urumia was not anything that reflected that. So the grammatical rules were different, and there was no written form for it. And in fact, Perkins and his colleagues did that. He also authored the book 8 Years of Residence, which kind of established who he is and what he had done, and really reflected in detail what the group was doing in its early days. Asahel Grant followed Perkins a year after his arrival, and he was from upstate New York. He was a doctor, and he spent most of his time in the mountains. He died as a result of trying to help fleeing refugees, himself sort of being victim of the conditions that were created by that. But his focus again was to go into the mountains, basically areas that had never been explored before by Westerners. The third missionary that's profiled, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on him, is Dr. Cochrane. He actually was a child of Iran. He was born in Iran. He was a child of American missionaries in Iran. He received his medical training in the United States and then went back, and he established the first medical college in Iran, which was in Urumia. He too died in the process of serving, in his case, patients, not refugees at that point. And then the last missionary that's profiled in my work is William Ambrose Shedd, who was also a child of Iran. He was also born to missionary parents, Princeton graduate, and he, on top of everything else he did, he took a step perhaps a little too far, in that in his final year, he took on the role of becoming a vice consul of the United States in Urumia. And then there's a lot of debate, and he also had some conflicting perspectives on that, and himself was conflicted about the fact that he had taken on that role. But he studied Islam very carefully. He wrote a book on Islam. He lectured on Islam. And so these are the four missionaries that this book provides some detail on. It already is an incomplete work, I have to confess, because just if you look at the first batch of missionaries, which were there up until 1872, there in fact were many. And so this is a listing. I know it's a little blurred. I tried my best to capture it into PowerPoint, and I apologize if it's not perfect. The right-hand column is highly informative. It has basically three categories. W means withdrawn. So the person says, I can't do this, I'm out of here. Then there is T, which means they transfer. So they're not like, okay, they just transfer to some other station, maybe somewhere else in the Ottoman field or some other mission station. And then there's D, which means died. And so if you look at this chart, one of the notable things that you see here is that there are many with the letter D in front of their names. About 1 in 3 died on the field. And so this is a relatively high-risk group. I would argue much higher risk than if we think of American missionaries that were in Tabriz or Tehran in later years. And not only that, in some cases, the stories are absolutely sad. So the Mitchells, which you can see here, they arrived in 1841 as a couple, and they died in 1841 as a couple. And again, so you see this true threat to their lives. And as I mentioned, the majority of those because of disease and because they were just not physically prepared to be in that environment. It's important to recognize that the Americans were not first in terms of being as missionaries being active in this field. There were predominantly Catholic orders that were present throughout Iran. So they were not in Urumia. The Americans were first, but throughout other parts of Iran, primarily in the border with Russia, towards the south, in the Persian Gulf, and in parts of Iran like Esfahan, where there was a big population of Armenians, there were in fact other Catholic missions. But the Americans were first in Urumia. And not only that, those missions kind of stayed stagnant for a long time, and the Americans came in technically speaking, in 1835 is when the mission station opened, first under the umbrella of what is called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And then in 1871, that whole role was transferred over to the Presbyterians, which is one of the reasons, as you hear the talks by other speakers in the past, or as there's a conversation about American presence in Iran, as we talk about people like Dr. Jordan, they are Presbyterian because the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions took over in 1871 the role of managing missionary activities in Iran. There was basically a breakup in the ABCFM in 1870, which caused that divide to happen. And then what we see is right after the Americans entered the field in Urumia, the French arrived as well. And then toward the end of the 19th century, we see a large number of other countries present in Urumia: Russians, Germans, the British. And so it became very active and intense at that time. These are just some images of the school systems that they had in place. And so what you see at the top is the Fidelia Fisk Seminary. It was just called the Fisk Seminary. What you see at the top left-hand side, that is on the top right-hand side, that's a village school set up by the Americans. What you see at the bottom is also a village school, but in the mountains. And you can actually see, it's amazing. They have actually carved in on the side of the mountain a room, which is the school room. And you can also see the lady that is in the front is a graduate of the Fisk Seminary. So these, basically the seminary created an environment where there would be teachers, and these teachers would be teaching the future generations. And this, by the way, was an American concept that Fidelia Fisk imported from Mount Holyoke College, which is still around. Back then it was called Mount Holyoke Seminary. So the first thing I want to talk about, and again, depending on how much time we have, I will cut that short as need be, is the role that the missionaries themselves had in the establishment of the diplomatic relations between the United States and Persia. And so it really starts again with the missionary I had mentioned earlier, Joseph Cochrane, who, as I mentioned, was a child of Iran himself. He spoke all the local languages. I would argue certainly more than most of us can claim to be able to speak. And he, at a very young age, he was brought to Buffalo to live with a relatively wealthy family who supported his education. And he became a medical doctor at the age of 23, returned to Iran. And actually at that young age, he established Iran's first medical college. Now I know this actually can be controversial because the argument as to whether was it really the first medical college, and we can get into that conversation later. But it's interesting. Most of the time you see Cochrane in a couple of very unique sort of environments. Either he's with his patients or he's with his students. The idea that you would have a medical school in Iran, rather than sending Iranians overseas to learn medicine, was something he was inspired to. And this is a direct quote from him. It's a mission of teaching the medical science to the young men of this nation, being Iran, here, and right here in their homes. His belief, and maybe he was reflecting on his own experience, was that if you send the students overseas, they lose their connection with their own people, and we know studies that have looked at movement of people and students overseas. Some of the work that Dr. Shannon himself has done, I think, reflect on this quite well. We might lose that connection because of westernization, if you will. And so he wanted to avoid that. He wanted them to be local, to be close to their own people. And so that was quite interesting because it very much is different from how you would think we would want to have Western education, the idea of sending them overseas. He wanted it all to be local. And other things you notice about Joseph Cochrane, very sort of a fun person. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of him trying to learn how to ride a bicycle. On the left-hand side, it's a child. I think it was a 3-year-old child. He found a starving orphan, in fact, in the market in Urumia, who he actually himself adopted as his own. And so a very loving person from that perspective as well. And if you notice, he's in front of a brick building, and you see that brick building in the background in a lot of pictures. In some of those pictures, you see the brick building with people with a lot of guns. And so that's one of the unique things about Cochrane, is that he could connect with all classes and all sorts of people. And so he would get visits from tribal leaders and tribes with, weapons, very powerful people. And he would be able to speak with them. He would be able to negotiate with them. He'd be able to talk with them. One of the things that happened in 1879, which again, you see this building, this brick building, that's the hospital. It was named the Westminster Hospital. The reasoning why it's called Westminster is that it was funded by the Westminster Church of Buffalo, which is a Presbyterian church. It still is there. And so the idea was that they purchased a very large piece of land. And this is, again, extracts from the missionary writings, his own writing in this case. And just in the interest of saving time, I've highlighted the parts that are critical to this. Basically what we have is the description of what he had acquired, the land, and it wasn't just him. John Haskell Shedd was the head of the mission at that time. A very large piece of land that had been acquired, and you see sort of the visuals of this. This land itself was acquired from someone else who had already developed it into a fortress type structure, 15 acres. And you can actually see again in missionary pictures what that fortress looked like, these tall walls that became extremely important to the protection of the Assyrian population during World War I. And so what happened, you can actually see this wall here again. It's a 1904 photograph of the same facility. So this facility basically turned into what was called the Kola compound by the locals. Nothing to do with the fact that it was later called college. Kola meaning fortress, al-e in Farsi, if you want to refer to that. And it truly became a fortress for the Americans. You can actually see again early photographs of the insides of this fortress. They call it the college compound, and it's because it did in fact have a college. The medical college was there as well. And so, an absolutely impressive facility that was built, tall trees, big avenues, and so a whole area of missionary buildings and facilities. A satellite image today would show you the exact same thing. This facility is still around. The hospital that was built is still around. The building is still there. It is no longer used as a hospital, but it is physically still there. It's used as an administrative office. And so the satellite image today would show you that pretty much everything is there as well. And so if you were to take the satellite image and zoom back, and if you were to rewind time to 1880, what you would see is that, yes, the mission compound is there. Close to the mission compound, when I say close, within about 20 miles or so, roughly, was a village or a town called Nuchia. And this is where things began to happen in 1880 that resulted in the formation of diplomatic relations between the United States and Persia. In it was the base of a very powerful tribal leader by the name of Sheikh Obeidullah. And he had influence. The red area that you see here is a sphere, rough outline, if you will, of the sphere of his followers. So he had a very strong following, and he had a strong interest in seeking independence for the Kurdish people. This is his own castle, if you will. It's an impressive picture because it was actually taken by Cochrane himself. Cochrane visited Ubaydullah because Ubaydullah was not feeling well. So he visited him during the summer of 1880. They spent 1 week together. Evidently, a lot of the conversation was actually theological in nature, and Ubaydullah was very well versed on Christian theology. And so those conversations were taking place, and a sense of confidence between the two men developed. And Ubaydullah asked Cochrane to help him connect with the British representatives in Tabriz to begin to converse about whether they are open to the idea of a Kurdish state being carved between Persia and the Ottoman territories. And Cochrane really didn't want to have anything to do with that. He wanted to stay neutral. He just passed on the message to the British, and that's that. So he left it at that. He did not want to have anything to do. This was one of the key things about the Presbyterian missionaries then, and I would argue later on, and for many years, they didn't want to interfere with the internals of certainly of Persia. And but what happened was that because the followers of Ubaydullah were being persecuted within the Persian territories, that gave him the pretext to attack, and so he did. And so in the second half of the 1880s, in 1880, he attacked. The red area that you're seeing here is the range of his attack, and it was rather harsh. So it covered cities like Miandab and Mahabad, which are further out to the west. It didn't come into Urumia, but it was surrounding Urumia. And one of the things about this that makes it much more, sort of challenging is that Ubaydullah was conversing or connecting, communicating with Cochrane while all of this was going on. And that created some sense of suspicion. In fact, again, in the missionary writings, I'm just highlighting again what is there, just the extracts, because there's not enough time that we have today to get into the details. But, the notion that it is very difficult to maintain a neutral position. He wanted to not take sides. He didn't want to interfere in the internals of what was happening. And the Persians also, this is the Persian government forces, realized that he's in conversation and maybe he could mediate this situation. And so they asked Cochrane to go back to Ubaydullah and ask him to delay what seemed to be an imminent attack. So Ubaydullah agreed, delayed his attack. Now, the reason he delayed his attack was not out of his sort of graciousness. It was because he was hoping that the Urumia population would just surrender. But in that time, the Persians were able to enter and reinforce their defensive positions in Urumia. And eventually, the Ubaydullah's forces were repelled from the area. And it's one of those interesting things because it's a 24-hour time period purely negotiated by Cochrane. The alternative could have been quite bad if the defensive forces of the Persian army could not relocate to where they had. It's quite possible that Urumia would have been taken, and it is quite possible that it would have never been able to be retaken by the Persian forces. So it's again one of those 24 hours that, in fact, I would argue the world has forgotten, and that is a 24-hour time period that we owe arguably to Cochrane for having negotiated on behalf of the people. And here's where it gets really interesting, because despite the fact that he negotiated that and he defended the city by allowing that time to happen so that the Persians could reinforce their defensive positions, he was looked at with suspicion because he was talking to both sides. And so again, in the missionary writings, what you see here, we see that conversation about this reservation as to, well, they're worried. The missionaries themselves are worried for their own lives because they are being viewed as potentially, complicit in this whole process. The bigger picture is that the risks to their lives were recognized, but there was no representation, a diplomatic representation of the United States in Persia. And what ended up happening is that the British were contacted in London by the American ambassador in London, and then a message was relayed back to Persia that was then relayed to the Shah that then was relayed back to Azerbaijan, and a reassurance was given that the missionaries did the right thing, that they were not complicit, and so peace was achieved. But what also came about because of this is that there was a recognition that the American lives would be at risk if there's no official U.S. representation. So the two people that you see here at the in the photograph are John Haskell Shedd and his wife. His wife actually was the sister of a U.S. congressman who petitioned for the opening of the American embassy in Tehran, which opened in 1883. What's really interesting is that Samuel Benjamin, who was the first American ambassador to Iran, was himself the child of American missionaries. So there, but he didn't stay in that position for too long, and he moved on. I don't think there is enough time for me to focus on the fragile nature of this because of just pure timing. But I do want to fast forward a little bit as to what did happen eventually years after, and again bring back some of the messages as to, well, what's the legacy? What's left? Is everything gone? And so what happened is in 1907, as we know, the division of Iran between the British and the Russians took place. That whole area, partially triggered by that divide, became more volatile. So the area to the northwest was beginning to be challenged by Ottoman forces, and there was intrusion. In fact, it's hard to even mention intrusion because the border itself was never marked. There was no markings on the land to say, well, this is the border. And so this is a picture taken by William Shedd, one of the missionaries profiled in my book, that he himself took. These are actually Ottoman forces in Persia that have actually taken a cannon that was that belonged to Persian forces. So it became very volatile. At some point in time, believe it or not, to bring down the temperature and make sure the missionaries, because of a separate incident, are not at risk, William Doty, who we know in the context of the world of Baskerville as a negative character, was approached by the missionaries to go into to the Ottoman territories to negotiate a cool down with some of the tribal groups that were there to make sure that the missionaries' lives were not going to be at risk. It's a fascinating thing that actually Doty was proposed that. It never was executed, by the way, but again, a work that Abraham Yesselson had done in 1956, looking at the US Department archives and the internal communications that were declassified, shows that the picture that you're seeing is also new. This one is new because it comes from, again, one of the recently released missionary photo albums. The photo taken by William Shedd and showing, and it's very blurry, so it's hard to see, but the imprint on the picture says that it is Doty with the missionaries on an outing in 1907. And it is interesting that there's some kind of connection between what Yesselson had observed in the declassified documents and what we see in the missionary photo albums. This is again 1907, the unrest that was happening. I believe that one was Tabriz, but that whole region, as we know from the Baskerville story, and the unfortunate loss of Baskerville shortly after that in 1909, and again putting things in context of previous research that's been presented in the Baskerville Institute, as we know, Morgan Schuster's departure in 1912. So things were beginning to get much more unstable. The border itself, as I mentioned, was unmarked. So a special group was put together to make sure the border becomes clear, because the clarification as to where the Ottoman border is would have made life a lot simpler for the missionaries in Urumia. So some effort was made to do that in 1912. It wasn't really until 1913 when the border was established, but it was already too late. The whole area went into, sort of the first stages of World War I. This is a picture, again, as you can sort of see, this is a refugee group inside the American compound in Urumia, and that's Dr. William Shedd attending to them. There were, at its peak, about 20,000 refugees in the American compound. another couple of thousand in the French compound, and many were dispersed within Urumia into households and families that would take them. So, the number was much larger than 20,000. The city went into disarray in 1918, so a civil war broke out. And obviously it was not a pretty scene. And in fact, in August of 1918, the Ottomans came into Urumia, and there was a mass flight of refugees outside of Urumia. Their destination was originally Hamadan, which took them weeks to get through. So the total number of refugees that had to go was about 70,000, and the estimates are that 20,000 of those died on the way, and among them was actually William Shedd. So William Shedd accompanied them on this, and he himself died as a result of cholera, not violence, but cholera. Much of the deaths were actually not directly because of direct violence, but the side effects or sort of the byproduct of that. What is notable, and it's very important to recognize, that while this exodus was taking place, the American Red Cross was present. They actually had ambulances that were moving along with the mass of people that were moving, and so a massive amount of money had already been raised in the United States under the umbrella of the Near East Relief, and that money was channeled back, and it was actually partially beneficial in this particular case to protect what could be protected. Now the question is, what's left? What is left of this group? On the Urumia University campus today, you will still find the residence of Dr. Cochrane. It is highly respected. Dr. Cochrane is still respected in Iran, despite the fact that there have been, 4 decades of hostilities between the two countries. There is a sense of respect and long-term recognition for his contribution to the education, the training of doctors, building the medical school, and building a hospital there. The compound, as you can see, is still there, but it is now the campus of Urumia University. The remains of the missionaries are, for the most part, in a village called Sir, which is to the south of Urumia, and so the cemetery is still there, I believe, right now. This is an older picture, but right now the walls are, it has brick walls, so it's not as easy to access, but their gravestones are still there. One of the things that actually, if you speak Farsi or if you've lived in Iran, one of the things that's interesting is that this was an agricultural college. This now is an agricultural college, but it became also an agricultural college in its later years before World War I. And so one of the contributions of these missionaries, aside from all the other things that they had done on the field of medical work and education, was the introduction of new species of fruits and vegetables to Iran. So, for example, tomatoes and strawberries, they're called Tut Farangi and Goja Farangi. The Farangi part means from foreign or by foreigners, and those foreigners are the Urumia missionaries. So that's something we actually really don't recognize, but they are the ones that brought these species into consumption in the Iranian domain. Now, the mission itself was shut down by Reza Shah in the 1930s because of a whole area of things, pressures to kind of nationalize education, but especially there was a need that Reza Shah felt that he does not want the Americans to stay in Urumia because it might have potentially provoked some degree of reaction and some degree of instability because they were perhaps too close or too supportive of the Assyrian population. For whatever reason, it shut down. But what we know, of course, is as we know from other works that have been presented in the Baskerville series and in other places that you may have read, is that many other missions open elsewhere. All of, in fact, these missions are to the north. And you wonder why did they skip Isfahan? Why did they skip Shiraz and all these major cities? And the reason for that is that though there was an agreement between the Americans and the British that the Americans would operate to the north and the British would operate to the south. So there were mission stations by the Church Missionary Society to the south, but of course they are British and they're not American mission stations. They're not Presbyterian mission stations. So so what you see here is sort of, you actually physically see that divide. What I want to wrap up is just one word, and then we'll maybe open up for some conversation and Q&A, is this. These are the words of William Shedd. William Shedd was someone who was truly interested in understanding the locals. He spent a ton of time, almost like an anthropologist, spending time trying to figure out how people think. And in fact, again, to look back as to why I am studying, or why I studied these folks, it was for the same reason. It was about decision making. You know, how do people assess situations? How do they decide to either say, do nice things or do bad things? How do they decide to, you know, move in one direction or another? He was concerned about the same thing, but in the context of mission work. And so he would spend a ton of time individually, one-on-one, with normal people, lay people, you know, the everyday person, talking about them as to what motivates them, what bothers them, those kinds of things. And so this is one of his words, which I think is extremely important. You know, how superficially we've reached the spirit and the mind of Persia. We must, some of us, take time from the grind and machinery to get closer to the quarters of the people by loving controversy, fellowship, and find out what their beliefs and struggles are. This, I would argue, despite the fact that William Shedd was very controversial, very critical of Howard Baskerville, in this way, and this was not said in the context of Baskerville, what he's describing here is a beautiful state of mind where we take the time to understand the other side. And I think in that sense, he was, without knowing it, implicitly describing Baskerville, because that is in fact what Baskerville did. As you know from from what is known of Baskerville, you know, he spent a lot of time trying to understand what the Persian struggle was during the Constitutional Revolution and the struggle of people in Tabriz. And so I think that's it. With that, I will stop sharing the screen, and Matthew, I'll leave that to you and Batman, I guess. I have probably gone way over time. Have I been? You're on mute, Matthew.
I don't think it's a problem at all. I think we all enjoyed listening to you speak for the hour, and you know, everyone has stuck around to the very end and to participate in the Q&A. So thank you so much for.
Thank you.
Very informative lecture, and especially the visuals were quite nice.
Great. Thank you.
I'll just go through some questions that have been posted throughout the talk, and a lot of them are kind of brief questions, and they get a bit more involved as we go forward. But there's a question about the 1860 map being in the book, and I guess they wanted to know if the maps you were showing on the slide would be in the book.
The maps are in the book. They are sourced from a book that actually was written about S.L. Grant. It's a book by Thomas Laurie. Yes, but they are in the book. Yes, they are. Yes.
Okay, good. There's a question about the origin of the word Watertown. They're wondering if the name's root was Rum, the traditional name for Anatolia, or if it's something else.
You know, again, I'm not a linguist myself, but whoever asked that question, please email me and I'll give you the source article. So I don't have a good answer to that. I just go to the research article and that's what they tell me, and that's what I've sourced it. So please email me just my last name at fordham.edu and I will provide you with a source article.
Certainly. And of course, we have a lot of comments coming in, just kind of congratulating you on the talk and thanking you for the informative lecture, in addition to some of the questions. There's a question from an individual who describes himself as a Mish kid, but of a later generation. And their parents were Presbyterian missionaries in Iran from the late 40s to the late 1960s. And so this was a very meaningful presentation for them. But the question is about, based on your research, if you've been able to determine kind of how local populations across Iran viewed the missionaries and their impact on society in the 19th century. So I guess maybe the question is not just about Urumia, but also some of those other mission fields that you
Right.
showed to us at the end of the talk.
Well, to be honest with you, I have not researched the impact on other mission fields. In fact, even again, I'm sort of in full disclosure, I have not really even spent time looking at Tabriz in detail. I have really just focused on Urumia. But focusing on Urumia itself, the impact has varied over time. So in the earlier days, when I say earlier days, the 1830s, late 1830s when the mission began, the presence of the mission was widely accepted by all population groups. It was helping more than anything on the medical field. So the idea that you have medical doctors with more current ways of taking care of diseases, both surgical procedures and new ways of creating modern forms of medications. It was one of the selling points of the mission itself. And one of the other things, by the way, that made the mission, it's very interesting because the missionaries came from the world of the Second Great Awakening. There was, they were the idea of temperance, the idea of not consuming alcohol was fundamental to the way they sort of behaved themselves. So they never drank. And in fact, for the Muslim population to find out that these were Christians, they were not drinking alcohol, that's a critical thing in Islam. So they were very well received. In terms of coming into that community. As time evolved, again, as we can see, in the case of Cochrane, he literally saved the city, but for a certain short period of time, there was ambivalence as to how the locals felt about the missionaries at that point in time. When we get closer to the end of the 19th century, because of the violence, the tribal violence, which also took a religious angle, the Sunni Kurds against the Assyrians, Christians, the Armenians further up to the north, the presence of the missionaries potentially aggravated some of those forces, possibly. But again, they were there to defend and to protect a population that was highly vulnerable. And then when we get to the area of the time frame of World War I itself, part of the problem was that the Near East relief funds that were becoming available in Urumia to protect the refugees were also being channeled to the rebels that were actually armed, and that itself kind of created a conflict of interest, which even William Shedd acknowledged and wrote about. So it has evolved over time. What is remaining of it today, if you think about Urumia University honoring Cochrane and the facility and sort of recognizing that original contribution that was made, is that there was definitely a positive feeling, and that positive feeling has remained, more than a century after.
Wow, thank you very much. And there's a lot of actually very interesting, if you're able to see it, I don't know, but there is some interesting commentary outside of questions about kind of some of the linguistic questions, which we can certainly capture for you. And there is also some conversation about the relatives of Dr. Cochrane, mainly references to Dr. Joe and Bernice Cochrane, who were working in that kind of post-war period. And another comment kind of confirms that they were relatives of Dr. Joseph Cochrane,
Yes,
both comments from folks in the mission network. So it really speaks to your kind of point about multi-generational missionary
and all three
families.
were called Joseph. So there was Joseph Plum Cochrane, which is the Dr. Cochrane that we're talking about. And then his father was also Joseph Cochrane, and his son was also Joseph Cochrane. And his son also served in some of the most difficult circumstances. And there are images of him visiting his family home in, I think, the 1960s, just that building I was just showing you that is on the Urumia University campus, visiting that building. So it is a family that served there for arguably an entire century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could make an argument that those multi-generational kind of families, I mean, there we have just at least 3 generations of Cochranes born in the country could be one of the most kind of significant kind of aspects of the missionary encounter, beyond some of the large institutions, but these kind of personal relations that families are able to cultivate over a century or whatever it may be. It's not something that the average American would have been able to do at that time.
Well, Matthew, it's one of those things that actually fascinated me with this group, because the pictures I showed you at the very beginning, the recognition that half of in fact, even the picture that's at the front of the book, the one that I opened up with, half of the people there are actually Iranian Americans. You can think of it that way, but they are a product of missionary work and a product of sort of children of Iran, if you will. And so that I think is fascinating. I'm not so sure if the same multi-generational legacies that we have seen in Urumia of American missionaries giving birth to American missionaries, again, generation after generation of American missionary work or humanitarian work for that matter, is as present in other cities of Iran where American missions were based, partially because Urumia was so isolated from everywhere else. So the tendency was you serve in Urumia, you almost had no interaction with most of the rest of Persia. You would go to the United States to get educated. So they would go to schools like Princeton and Yale and so on and so forth, but they would come back straight to Urumia. They wouldn't go somewhere else.
There are a few questions about the women of the mission, missionary wives and women of the period. And one question just asks about them, and there's another question that asks about Cochrane's daughter and a book titled "My Life in the Muslim East." And
yes.
Those two questions.
Sure. Okay, so, in terms of missionary wives, the missionary wives were just as active as the male missionaries. There was a tendency in the earlier days of the American Board of Commissioners to, when they send off a male missionary, they would ideally want them to leave the United States married. And the idea was that they would go as a family to Iran. They would, I don't think in any case they had children when they left, so they would go there, they would form their family in Urumia. But the emphasis, there are very rare cases, like James Merrick went there as a single person. I'm not really sure why. That's an interesting question, but he was a very difficult person. He probably had a difficult time finding a spouse, despite the brilliance of thought that he had and the fact that he really should have been recognized a lot more by the American board. But they went there as a couple, they formed families. The idea was that the female missionaries would have an inside access to the locals. So they would be able to connect with the females in the population that they're serving. And that itself would make it possible for further advancing of the conversations that they were going to have in terms of modernizing, in terms of literacy campaigns, in terms of healthcare. And so they were facilitators. They were just as active as the males. In fact, more, I would argue, because on top of that, they had to take care of the children. I think, so that's that group. Emma Cochrane's book that I think was being referred to, My Life in the Muslim East, Emma Cochrane actually served with Cochrane for a while in the hospital that was built. And so she became a nurse and she served in that hospital. She later married a Russian royal family member. And so she moved to Russia and she lived there for some time. Her book describes it. It opens up with some of the most dramatic situations, the conditions under which she was born, in which case she was born on the same night that a child had just been killed because of some violence that was taking place in that village. And so it's a very insightful book that shows a difficult life that they had as children of missionaries. In fact, the picture of the cemetery that I showed you, almost half of those gravestones are gravestones of children. So her book kind of reflects sort of that inside perspective of what it was to be a child, what it was to live there. And then more than half of it actually is about other things other than Urumia, because she moved on to Russia for the later part of her life.
And I promise everyone that we have a record of the chat and the Q&A to provide Professor Estelami with everything that's been kind of generated over the course of
I'm sure there are a lot of good
webinar.
research ideas there, by the
Well,
way.
there are references to specific journals and kind of comments on the language questions, and I'll leave it to you two. And they're all seem very informative and very positive. So I'll leave it to you to kind of sift through those and contact those if you see fit. But we also, of course, have many great questions still coming in, and so we keep moving through. I was taken by the list from the Karimi thesis that you posted, which has all the names of people who served in Iran as missionaries. I've used that myself, and I think there are about 400 Presbyterians and maybe 40 or so ABCFM. So we're talking about under 500 total, but so fewer missionaries over all that time than Peace Corps volunteers in just a few short years, for instance. But the impact is so consequential. So it was nice to see other researchers using that list.
Well, if I may just say about Karimi's piece, unfortunately, she passed away, I think 3 or 4 years ago. Her work, she did a doctoral, it was a master's dissertation. As I'm sure you noticed when you read that piece itself, it's a beautifully written, highly informed perspective. That list that you and I are talking about, again, is a very important list because it breaks down what happened before the break between the Presbyterians and the American board. And yeah, it's a very informative list, and it's one of those rare lists that I think really helps understand who was where and who did what.
Certainly, and in that volume, there's a list of kind of notable graduates of mission schools and especially Alborz College. But the question is wondering about if you came across more comprehensive student lists, especially for the college/seminary in Urumia, or any of the schools and other posts. So do we get that type of information about students in the archives, or do we not get that level of detail?
Oh, great question. I have never looked for that list. The college compound is a mystery because the record keeping on that was not perfect. The compound itself, during the final days or the final couple of months, well, in summer of 1918 to be specific, was destroyed when the Ottomans attacked. So a ton of material was lost, including a library that was kept at the college, which had ancient Syriac texts that were over the decades collected by the missionaries and kept there. So there's a ton of records that have been lost. So if there was, for example, a list of graduates of the college that would have naturally been maintained on the college compound, there's no reason they would have channeled it back to New York, where the Presbyterian board headquarters were at that time. It would have been lost, but I haven't looked for it. It's possible that it's retained somewhere. And if it is, it would have to be at the Presbyterian Historical Society, which is in Philadelphia. So I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately.
Yeah, at least in later years, it would have been unusual to find lists with names like that, but you would find kind of statistics based on nationality or religious background, or however, kind of the school population was being categorized at a given time. But individual names would have been rarer than that, at least in later periods. There are a few questions about the Kurdish populations in the Urumia region, and the one question asks about atrocities committed by the Kurds, and if that could play a more prominent role in the longer narrative about this history. And then there's another question about the development of kind of Kurdish identity and nationalism, and the question is wondering whether or not you have any commentary on, I guess, Kurdish identity and the atrocities committed by the Kurds as it relates to this history.
Right. They are related to some extent. If you think of the history, so focusing on these missionaries that we're talking about, the first one to have observed violence would have been Asahel Grant. So Perkins himself never really witnessed that scale of violence. Grant went into the Kurdish mountains looking after, in fact, originally the intent was to find the Assyrian patriarch who none of the missionaries had met before. So he was the first to meet him. But in that process, violence broke out in 1842, 1843. Grant himself died in 1844, but the violence continued until 1846. That violence was a result of tribal disputes between the Kurds and many of the locals, including the Assyrians. And it was led by Bedir Khan, who was the sort of the head of a big tribal sort of coalition in that region. So it had, of course, a very negative effect on the population. Numerically, 10,000 Assyrian lives were lost because of that alone between 1842 and 1846. Moving forward to 1880, which is the Sheikh Ubaidullah attack, again, it's interesting. Sheikh Ubaidullah promised the British and the Americans that no Christian lives would be harmed. But in that process of attacking the region, of course, a refugee crisis was created. And of course, Christian lives were affected. So, you know, the whole idea of, and by the way, it wasn't just Christian lives, it was Muslim lives as well. It was the villagers. It was, in fact, in Yandoab, it was a massacre of the Shiite, population. So it crossed many different perspectives. But on the other hand, of course, there's a claim that they felt that they need their own land and they were going to, carve their own land. I am really not qualified to make a point, but the historical records is all that I work at and all that I study. So I'm not really qualified to give an opinion, but there's no doubt that there was a great deal of violence that was inflicted on the region because of those efforts that was mentioned in the question. Yes.
All right, a lot of good commentary here about source material. I think kind of seeing everything you've been wading through has, got a lot of folks thinking about what types of sources we can use to study this history. Was there anything available in Iran that, kind of archivally that could inform this history? And one question is asking about missionary records transferred from Urumia to the National Archives of Tehran, and these records presumably dealt with the pre-World War I period, and it looks like they're cited by some Kurdish authors and others. And so I don't know if you have any specific information about that collection, but was there anything generally that you were using in the Iranian source base?
So in terms of the archives in Iran, I have not had access to them. I actually haven't been able to travel partially because of the travel restrictions and COVID and all that stuff. So that's in the works, hopefully down the road. But so I do not have access to those archives in Iran itself. In terms of Persian sources, you have to also, of course, take a look at it from what the Persian historians, have written. And so, to a large extent, I've relied on Kasravi and his writings, which are in Farsi and in old Farsi, so it makes it difficult to read. But that's one of the main sources. And again, with respect to things like the compound itself, in fact, there's a lot of research that's being done by scholars and faculty in Urumia itself. So, and they are published on occasion in Western journals and accessible in that environment. But this is one of the challenges when you study missionaries, because they themselves write so much and keep the records so meticulously that here we are 150 years after the fact, maybe even more than 150 years after the fact. And you can go into to the archives and touch the paper that was written in 1860 and read it. Or they're available. So that's a beautiful thing. But then the problem that it creates is that, for example, we have nothing. There's actually, even if you try, there's very little available in terms of the perspective from the Assyrian side. So, there's some writings by Assyrian writers. from the late 19th century, early 20th century that are published and accessible. But it's on a relative basis, as far as the volume of writing that's available, it's far smaller than the masses of writing that the missionaries did. I mean, they came from great schools. They were hardworking people. They loved to write. And so there's a little bit of bias that exists because you have that a lot more to work with from the missionary sources.
Yeah, I can concur on that point. Just the volume of writing is very large, and sometimes just practicality leads to the focus on a particular locality, like you kind of did in your book.
Right.
There are questions about, I guess, more broadly relate to Perkins and the missionaries' work with the modern language in Urumia. And there was a question about, books that would have been put out by the printing press, the mission printing press, and just there is a kind of a bibliographic book by David Mallet that lists some of these, but
Yes.
The questions relate to whether or not we can find them, or if the originals still exist anywhere, or if you have any commentary on that.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have any comment on that in terms of where to source them, other than, just check eBay every day, because you might be surprised as the stuff that pops up if you are regularly checking that, oddly enough, just eBay itself. But in terms of the output of the mission printing house, yes, it was massive. And you're right, I think it's Malik's book that has sort of a catalog of all that was produced. And it is one of the biggest contributions. Just to put things in perspective, when Perkins came, there was no written form of modern Syriac. There were no grammatical principles. So there was no way for him to create an educational system, because people couldn't read and people didn't know what to read or how to read. And so him and another missionary by the name of Stoddard developed, and in fact, Stoddard's book, which is about the modern Syriac grammar, the principles of that grammar, I believe is still in use in discussing sort of those principles. And so the mission press evidently, again, I can't remember the statistics in Malik's book, but we're talking about millions of pages that were printed out of that printing house. And as to where they are, unfortunately, I don't have. My closest suggestion would be eBay, which is kind of a silly and simplistic way of responding.
All right. Well, I just have, as we kind of come to our kind of marker here, running up on 90 minutes, I just have one more question. And again, I'll send you all the comments so you can reach out to folks. There's a lot of really rich material here, and I would just thank everyone for your contributions in the chat and the Q&A. But you made a really interesting point, actually, as you started your talk, and you kind of, your quote was, "I haven't quit my day job," that I'm doing research and, of course, business and kind of my fields of training, but that I've written this book for a range of other reasons. And it seems as if kind of the richness of the dialogue at Baskerville Institute events, kind of at least in part stems from that fact that there are so many people who maybe aren't a professionally trained historian, but people with training in other fields and kind of all kinds of reasons to be interested, who are writing about U.S.-Iran relations and who are weighing in on the contemporary conversation. It's been something that's, at least for me, been exciting to witness through the Baskerville webinars. And I was just wondering if you would care to leave us with any thoughts on that kind of broader phenomenon, with all of the different constituents in this history weighing in at this point.
I think this is a labor of love. This is, I think the intent is really to make sure we understand where the relationships between Persia and the United States, or Iran and the United States today, what was the source? Were there any problems? Was there something wrong that maybe today has also transpired? I was just fascinated by the group that was there in the first place, the people that were there in the first place. As you know, Matthew, when you read their writings, they were incredible writers. They were clear thinkers. And so I was just absorbed by that, and I just couldn't let go, and I still can't let go. But of course, I have my day job. When people ask me, why are you studying this? You're a business professor. I tell them, inspired by that old ad campaign, is that well, yes, it's true. I'm not a historian, but I did stay at the Holiday Inn Express. So so the key is just to get engaged and read as much as you can. Double check with scholars. We are a family of scholars. I think people are willing to give each other feedback, and I really cannot thank you and Bahman and the Baskerville Institute enough for facilitating this. This is a channel that many have been looking for a long time, and the quality of the works that are being presented is just amazing. So we are thankful to you.
Thank you so much. I think you would hear a collective applause if we were all in a room somewhere in person, and a lot of folks would be hanging behind afterward, of course, to talk to you. But we'll use email for that purpose. Just to kind of conclude and to address a few technical questions that were raised, you can find this video and previous videos of webinars on the Baskerville Institute webpage. So check those out if you didn't attend previous ones and want to see what types of subjects have been covered. And moving forward, we have 3 more Baskerville Institute webinars this semester. We'll hear from Susan Maloney in February about the Iranian Revolution, more than 40 years since, and especially the economic dimensions of the more recent Iranian history. We'll hear from Richard Garlitz in March about Utah in Iran, Utah universities in particular, and their work in Iran. And in April, we'll hear from Persis Karim about the Iranian diaspora and the exciting work that the center in San Francisco is doing in that area of research. So thank you very much for attending today. Hopefully we'll see you in future events. And Professor Estelami, thank you so much for delivering such a wonderful talk, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care.